So Ukraine has been taking a lot of military actions against Russia this week. As you probably heard, this is a popular front here. Ukraine struck 4 Russian air bases in a coordinated long-range drone attack, destroying over 40 aircraft, including Tu-95 and Tu-22 M3 bombers, as well as an A-50 surveillance jet. The drones were smuggled deep into Russia. So this is a video that I found explaining exactly how they did this.
Ukrainian engineers designed a clever drone launching system disguised as ordinary wooden cabins mounted on the backs of cargo trucks. These mobile containers looked like simple rural sheds, but inside they held reinforced structures, hidden launch platforms, battery charging stations, and remote-controlled roof mechanisms. The design allowed for drones to be launched either vertically or at an angle, depending on their type, while built-in signal shielding helped them avoid early detection by Russian surveillance. Once these mobile silos were ready, Ukrainian intelligence operatives, possibly with help from local sympathizers, moved them deep into Russian territory. The trucks were quietly driven to pre-selected sites near key airbases, parked in places like forests, farms, or industrial areas where they blended into the landscape. They remained dormant for days or even weeks, with drones preloaded, charged, and waiting for the command to strike. When the time came, encrypted activation signals were sent remotely. The roofs of the containers slid open and the drones lifted off, some vertically, others using ramps or compressed air launch systems for a silent start. Because the launch sites were positioned just a few kilometers around 2 miles from their targets, the drones were able to reach their objectives quickly, leaving little time for Russian defenses to react. Operators guided them in real time using live video feeds, steering the drones with precision toward parked aircraft, fuel depots, and radar installations.
Okay, now this was just breaking a couple of hours before we went on. Now, the same Ukrainian operations unit has, according to reports, bombed the bridge to Crimea. So Ukraine strikes bridge connecting Russia to Crimea with underwater explosives. Ukraine said on Tuesday that it hit the bridge connecting Russia and the occupied Crimean Peninsula with explosives planted underwater in its third attack on the vital supply line for Moscow's forces since the full-scale war began in 2022. Ukraine's security service, the SBU, said on Telegram that its agents had mined the piers of the road and rail Crimean bridge, also called the Kerch Bridge, and detonated the first explosive at 4:44 a.m. Tuesday. The whole operation took several months, it added. The agency said it had used 1,100 kilograms of explosives, which severely damaged the underwater pillars supporting the bridge. For Americans, 1,100 kilograms is a fuckload. Russian officials did not immediately respond to Ukraine's claims. Traffic on the bridge has been temporarily suspended, the bridge operator announced on its official Telegram account. They've also shut down shipping nearby. Although the scale of the damage was not immediately clear, Tuesday's attack is the latest example of the SBU's attempts to blindside Moscow and demonstrate that there are costs to continuing its war. So you can see here the location of the Kirk. Do we say Kirk or Kerch? Kerch?
I'm
Uh,
not sure.
we're not sure.
We'll have to ask Scott Ritter.
So this bridge, as you can see, is very strategically important in connecting Russia to Ukraine as part of the whole military effort to incorporate the eastern part of Ukraine into Russia proper. Although the scale of the damage was not immediately clear, Tuesday's attack is the latest example of the SBU's attempts to blindside Moscow and demonstrate that there are costs to continuing its war. On Sunday, the SBU launched an audacious drone attack on Moscow's fleet of nuclear-capable bombers stationed at various Russian airfields thousands of miles away from Ukraine. Vasyl Malyuk, the head of the SBU, said that attack caused an estimated $7 billion in damage and had struck 34% of Russia's strategic cruise missile carriers, which have been used to pummel Ukrainian cities throughout the war. As well as serving as a vital supply line for Moscow's troops, the Crimean Bridge also has huge symbolic value for President Vladimir Putin, embodying his objective to bind the Ukrainian peninsula to Russia. Built after Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, Putin opened the bridge in 2018. Project cost around 3.7 billion. So some reactions from around the nets. Dr. Charlie Ward here. Yesterday's Ukrainian drone attack struck an Arctic Russian submarine base nearly 2,000 kilometers from Ukraine. No help from NATO? I don't think so. They're still trying to drag us into World War III. Seems like a fair point. This is a very sophisticated operation. We know that Ukraine has been heavily dependent on Western intelligence for its targeting operations. It's hard to imagine they did something like this with no Western help. Not impossible, but it's a fair point. Um, Lindsey Graham was in Ukraine on Friday. Think we all know who's behind the attacks. Some people think Miss Lindsay might have been personally responsible. Um, an unusual silence from Russia after Ukraine's large-scale drone attacks. Never seen Moscow this quiet. Feels like the calm before the storm. Something big is about to happen. Hopefully they're wrong about that, but yes, Russia has been really quiet about this. Now, is this because they're shocked and embarrassed, or is it because they're about to launch an attack that is going to be shocking and cause a lot of political destabilization? We shall see.
I suspect the latter. I do. I hate to say it, but I do.
Yeah, those Russians are not ones to take their ball and go home. So this is our friend Matt Taibbi dropped this just this morning, actually. Ending the world to own Trump. Ukraine's 18-month plan to execute Russia's Pearl Harbor leaves humanity at the edge of extinction, and Western analysts are giddy. Yes, if you've seen the usual suspects covering this, giddy is the right word. So just a little bit of Matt's reporting here. If the Trump administration knew and does not move quickly to disavow Ukraine, Russia will be forced to conclude there is no post election policy change, and the Trump White House helped carry out a dangerous Biden era mission. If Trump didn't know, that's worse. Now, the presidency itself, the last avenue by which the American population could ask out of this conflict, has been humiliated and rendered irrelevant. And in another little later in the article, he says, peel away the gushing about Ukraine's brilliant technical performance, in quotes, and what you find everywhere underneath are American and European officials who believe now more than ever that Ukraine can win this war. They've rejected voters' demands that we stop supporting this endeavor financially and rejected their concerns about strategic risk. They want to keep fighting at any cost, even annihilation. They are deluded, treasonous, and insane. Okay. Well, that is certainly a take that I think a lot of people, particularly people who elected the current administration, partly to end our involvement in Ukraine and our support for that war, would certainly agree with. To Matt's point, if the American government backed this, that's terrible because it means you have voted to get us out of this and you can't do it. And if the government didn't know about it, well, what's Putin forced to conclude? Well, there's no reason to exercise any restraint because Trump can't do anything about this anyway. So in Matt's article, he included a video of Nicole Wallace and Rachel Maddow just absolutely just gushing over this, all from the point of view of Trump's not getting what he wants. Ukraine is showing Trump. Everything goes back to Trump. Everything is about Trump. It reminds me, and the libs are so fond of that meme of them in the cave with the campfire.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, this is like that meme. Yeah, the world ended in nuclear catastrophe, but boy, did we own Trump.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. I mean, that's a totally valid point. But also to Matt's point, Trump really owned himself here. He owned himself here. Because
In
either
one day,
way,
it was going to be over in one day.
well, yes, obviously there's the broken promise, but this is either a case of the administration going along with this and being consciously complicit in it, and that there's going to be a whole lot of cope from every which direction. Well, he said he wanted to end the war, and then he hired the wrong people, and the people got in his ear or whatever, blah blah blah. The point is, if we were consciously complicit in this, which the odds are we were, then what that says is that that sixth chamber in the Russian roulette game, well, maybe we'll skirt out of World War III. Well, turns out that was a big fucking con job that they pulled on you, if that's the case. If that's not the case, if this is just impotence, irrelevance, and weakness, well, then, yeah, absolutely. At this point, what incentive does Putin have to exercise restraints? Right. And we've seen a lot of talking online. So far, it's just been talking, but a lot of speculation that, if this goes on any further, and if these kinds of strikes happen, well, now you're going to be talking about a possible situation which was not conceivable at the start of the war, which is the wholesale conquering of Ukraine, which is something that Putin never wanted. But if you push it to this point, now you're all of a sudden seeing that as a possibility. That is a massive, massive failure of this administration. This administration ran on wrapping this up in 24 hours, wrapping this up before he even got to Washington. He says, I'm going to have this settled during the lame duck period. Now, you want to dismiss that as rhetoric? Fine. We are now in June. Okay? You can't explain away the failure to stop this war at this point, or at the very least, contain it. This was always going to be difficult to negotiate, more difficult than Trump was letting on. Because all we can really, at the end of the day, control is our involvement. It depends, as Taibbi says, how insane is Ukraine and how insane is the rest of Europe? And can they drag this timeline out long enough for Ukraine to do something crazy enough to escalate to a point where this becomes, an apocalyptic event, which it certainly has potential for. And the other question you have to ask, and this is something that we warned of days into the war, Ukraine cannot win this unless it becomes World War III. So as their situation becomes more desperate,
they have to drag us into it.
They have to. Well, they have to drag us into it, and they have to start throwing Hail Mary passes, which means their actions have to become more and more radical, not less and less. And so that creates an extremely dangerous situation, and Trump had no idea how to end this. Clearly, he had no idea how to end this war. Whether this was a conscious act with our direct help, or whether this is a reflection of our powerlessness over the situation, the basic truth underlying both scenarios, whichever is true, is that Trump had no idea really how to end this war. He knew how to browbeat Zelensky in the Oval Office because that's what he does. He knew how to talk tough. He knew how to talk a lot of shit because that's what he does. He really was no match for, not only no match for Vladimir Putin, he was no match for these European leaders. He could not get the deal done. He could not do it. So at worst, this is conscious sabotage. At best, this is a reflection of the fact that Mr. Art of the Deal came up really, really short in a really big spot.
Yeah, Trump doesn't understand anything other than bluster and bullying.
Right.
And you cannot build consensus that way. If your objective was really to end this war, you needed to give the Europeans some incentive to work with you. As soon as you come into office, you're talking about cutting off funding to NATO and tariffing everybody.
Right.
Well, why would they not just go their own way and do what they want? What
Right.
influence do you have at that point? What are you offering? He's such an arrogant dipshit. He just yeah, well, we're gonna tariff him, and we're gonna cut off NATO, and with no, these people were fighting wars for 1,000 years, man. They know how.
Right.
Like they've been them being dependent on us has been the aberration. It's not like the
Right.
Europeans do not have a history of being a warlike people that can figure out how to organize military forces and use them to create ongoing conflict and to sustain on. Ever heard of the 100 Years' War? Donald,
Right.
probably not. Probably not. So in his wisdom, he's decided to re-incentivize the essentially defanged and neutralized formerly very warlike Europeans to rearm themselves and start making their own military decisions again. And that is to our just in real politic terms. How is that to our advantage in as a nation? How
Yeah.
does that help us economically? How does that help us strategically? Case in point, if we weren't involved, as one of the posters said, NATO probably was.
Right.
I mean, how does that scenario benefit us? At that point, you don't even have the power to end this because you have incentivized NATO to figure out how to go around us and execute a very threatening military action that could inspire, yes, as you say, the more Russia loses, the more they're going to need to get to feel like they've been compensated for this war.
Sure. Of course.
The
Absolutely.
less they're going to be satisfied with just taking the Donbass.
Of course. Of course. I mean, it was reported. I think the numbers were, and I don't know I don't know how current these are, but I imagine they're still relatively, it's still ballpark. You're talking about, what, 1,000 people a day? I mean, just just an insane amount. You're talking about a casualty every couple of minutes. I mean,
Right.
this has really
Right.
been
Right.
underreported. Just the
Right.
level, the amount of carnage and the sacrifice. It's a horrible situation that should have never happened, and Trump is correct about that. But it's one thing to be correct about that; it's another thing to know how to stop it, which he clearly does
Right.
not. Yeah.
Yep.
Please clap.